Defining terms. It's important to define terms so that we understand what each other are talking about. Sometimes we can use words or phrases and have a meaning in our own heads, in our own minds, of what that word or those phrases mean. And other times it can be confusing. So, as I proceed with other videos and explaining certain things and my own experiences and understanding, I want to be clear of what I'm talking about. So, without explaining more as to why I'm defining terms, let's go ahead and define a few of them. The terms I'd like to define are occult, New Age, magic, mysticism, and Satanism. Now, there will be other times when I explain or define other words and phrases, but for now, I believe these are very important terms. So, beginning with the word occult. I believe this is the baseline for the rest of my discussions on other topics. And the reason is the word occult typically can be understood to refer to magic or the dark arts or the wider discussion of what I'm talking about. But it actually has a relatively benign meaning to it. In other words, it can refer to something that has nothing to do with magic or mysticism. Because at its core, occult means hidden or secretive or not very well known. In fact, there are some things in even medicine, something called occult blood. I won't get into that, but my point is just to say that the word occult itself does not necessarily have to refer to magic or the dark arts. But in our discussions, for the most part, 90% of the time, I will be using it in that context, as many others do as well. And I believe it's the baseline or the umbrella term, however you want to think of it, for other types of ideas and philosophies, such as magic or New Age or witchcraft. And that is because all of those other ideas are based on secretive or hidden or not very well known ideas and concepts. And so for me, in my experience, whether one would say I'm old school or more classical, so to speak, I refer to the wider range of these ideas as occult or the occult, and a more broader term of a noun, the wider idea and concept of things. So within the occult, we have things that would be considered New Age or witchcraft, etc. So let's define New Age. New Age has a lot of different interpretations depending on where you're coming from it. Most popularly, it's referring to something that came about during the 1950s through the 1970s, kind of that 60s decade, where there was the understanding that people were coming into a new age of enlightenment, of consciousness, that for the most part coincided with some type of astrological aligning of the cosmos. So it was a new age of things. And that's not too different than what even some historians have referred to. If you study history or have a basic knowledge of studying history, you'll know that there are different categories and time frames of human existence. There are the ancient times, the medieval times, the modern times, contemporary times. A lot of people don't know that there is actually a distinction between modern and contemporary times. So it's not very different than understanding human existence in those terms. However, the New Age is commonly refers to a time frame of when the whole of society, whether in America or even internationally, had a boost in their enlightenment or consciousness of these astrological alignings. And so out of that enlightenment of sorts came a lot of different types of mystical ideas, or as I would say, occult philosophies. However, because I'm defining these terms from my experiences, I understand the New Age to refer to something that was specifically described by Aleister Crowley, a 19th, 20th century occultist who was speaking of something specific to his own founded religion, the religion of Thelema. And what he was basically saying was that the New Age was the age that was being entered in of basically the self, a very hedonistic idea. Perhaps another time I'll explain more about that. But because he put forward these ideas in the 19th and 20th, early 20th centuries, I believe he was really much the founder of what would be considered the New Age. Not the sole founder, but one of the most influential founders of it, because his ideas of these magical, mystical, astrological ideas were then picked up in the 1960s and 70s and took on a whole nother life of their own. Some of you may know that song, Age of Aquarius. I believe that's the name of the song. This is the dawning of the age of Aquarius. And so this whole idea of a new phase in society is kind of what the New Age was about during the 1960s. But from my understanding, it refers more specifically to what Aleister Crowley was putting forward in his ideas. Again, a number of these definitions will inevitably be debated or contradicted by some others who are familiar with them, but I am presenting my own experience with these terms. The other term that I had mentioned was magic. Now, I will probably do a number of videos on the term magic itself because there is so much behind it historically, spiritually, that it's hard to just explain in one brief video. So what I'm going to do is again refer to Aleister Crowley. I won't always refer to him, but because he was so influential in a lot of ideas of other people, he will inevitably come up often in some of our discussions. There will be other people who I will be mentioning. But his definition for magic is well known amongst occultists, and that is, he defined it as the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will. Now, that in of itself is a very loaded definition, but the emphasis there, I believe, is will. And we'll come back to that. It's our will, not God's will. One of the other terms to define is mysticism. Now, mysticism is a bit tricky because it can also be used in a non-magical sense, but more often than not, it does incorporate a lot of magical ideas or occult ideas. And it really is kind of understanding a very subjective or personal experience of God or a gods, plural, in a very paganistic way. And because mysticism is not necessarily part of Scripture, it often uses a lot of other than Scripture sources in order to expand upon its ideas. So it's based on a very personal, subjective experience. And we see this, a few examples of that are in Eastern mysticism, like Tibetan mysticism, Buddhist ideas, or even Kabbalah is a very well-known type of mysticism to experience God through the one subjective higher sense, so to speak. But it is a type of understanding that is not known to the vast majority of people, of an experience with God not often understood or known to a lot of people. Now, the last term I want to define is Satanism. And it may sound odd that I've chosen this word amongst the other words to define in this video, but I think it's important, because often people use this term in a very broad sense. And sometimes it can be accurate, but oftentimes it's not. And the reason is the term itself is pretty self-explanatory if you understand who Satan is and the nature of Satan. Oftentimes, people get this idea of a red devil with horns and a tail and a pitchfork, often what we see in Warner Brothers or Acme cartoons. But there's a lot of background as to who Satan is. And so, yes, it is correct to say that it is essentially devil worship, but it's important to point out that during the 20th century, a person by the name of Anton LaVey founded a organization or religion known as the Church of Satan. Prior to him, there were other types of devil worship or recognizing the enemy as a prime entity. But he really made an influence during the mid 20th century by founding the Church of Satan. And for a lot of people, it was normalized. It kind of desensitized who Satan was. But by his own description, the Church of Satan in that religion was a type of humanism. At least according to their own self-identifying, they did not actually worship an entity of Satan. It was a type of figure to represent the self, essentially, a type of humanistic philosophy, very heavily influenced by people like Nietzsche, who had said God is dead. And so I'll go into that in other videos, but I just want to define that when we say Satanism, or when I refer to Satanism, more often than not, it will be referring to the 20th century understanding of it as understood or founded by Anton LaVey, because after him came a lot of other types of Satanism which were very close to what he had spoken about. And as I'll explain in other videos as well, Satanism and humanism are really kind of one and the same anyway. But that for another time. I just wanted to make that distinction for those of you who aren't familiar with the actual worship of the devil, of Satan, and the religious teaching that espouse more humanism rather than religious doctrine or religious worship.